The people who have almost nothing often carry the richest hearts. A cold autumn wind swept through the narrow streets of downtown Boston as evening settled over the city, scattering dry leaves across cracked sidewalks, while office buildings slowly emptied beneath a sky painted in fading shades of orange and gray. Most people hurried home with warm dinners waiting, their attention fixed on busy schedules rather than the strangers they passed every day. Hannah Brooks tightened the sleeves of her worn brown coat as she stepped out of the neighborhood grocery store carrying a single paper bag. Inside rested one small container of homemade chicken soup, 2 dinner rolls, and a fresh apple. It was everything she had managed to buy after carefully stretching another week's paycheck between rent, utilities, school supplies for her 6-year-old daughter Lily, and bus fare to work. Every purchase required calculation. Every dollar carried responsibility. Hannah glanced at the small paper receipt folded inside her wallet before smiling softly to herself. It would be enough. Somehow it always was. She began the familiar walk toward the apartment she shared with Lily, passing rows of restaurants where warm lights glowed behind polished windows and families gathered around tables filled with food. The comforting smells drifting into the street made her stomach remind her that she had skipped lunch again. She quietly ignored it. Lily would be waiting at home after spending the afternoon with their elderly neighbor, and sharing dinner together mattered far more than eating early. As Hannah approached a quiet public square near the old train station, she noticed a man sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench. His coat was thin, his shoes were worn, and his hands trembled slightly against the cold evening air. A small backpack rested beside him, but nothing else suggested he had anywhere to go. People walked around him without slowing, avoiding eye contact as though loneliness itself could somehow spread. Hannah stopped walking. She looked down at the paper bag in her hands, and then back toward the man. For a brief moment she hesitated, thinking of Lily waiting at home. Then she quietly crossed the sidewalk. "Good evening," she said with a gentle smile. The older man looked up, surprised that someone had spoken to him. "Good evening," he answered politely. Hannah held out the paper bag. "I think this belongs with you tonight." The man looked confused. "No, miss. That is your dinner." Hannah smiled warmly. "Then we have something in common." He slowly shook his head. "You should keep it." Hannah carefully placed the bag beside him anyway. "My daughter always tells me that soup tastes better when people know someone cares." The man looked at the simple meal for several silent seconds before whispering, "I cannot repay this." Hannah laughed softly. "I was not looking for repayment." She reached into her coat pocket and removed the small plastic spoon she had packed that morning. "Now you can enjoy it properly." The man's eyes quietly filled with gratitude. "What is your name?" Hannah smiled, but gently shook her head. "Tonight it is enough that you eat while it is still warm." Before he could ask again, she wished him a peaceful evening and continued walking toward home with empty hands but a lighter heart. She never noticed the dark luxury sedan parked across the street beneath a row of maple trees. Inside the rear seat sat Benjamin Foster, one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs, returning from a charity board meeting that had accomplished little more than approving another expensive fundraising gala. He had been reviewing business reports on his tablet when the unexpected scene outside the window quietly captured his attention. Without saying a word, he watched the young woman offer away the only meal she appeared to have. He watched her refuse recognition. He watched her leave before the older man even finished thanking her. Benjamin slowly lowered the tablet onto the seat beside him. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. His longtime driver glanced toward the sidewalk. "I do not know, sir." Benjamin continued watching Hannah disappear into the evening crowd. "Find out." The driver nodded. "Yes, sir." Benjamin looked once more toward the older man, now carefully opening the paper bag with trembling hands. The simple meal seemed impossibly ordinary compared to the extravagant dinners served every night inside restaurants only steps away. Yet somehow it carried more meaning than any banquet Benjamin had attended in years. As the sedan slowly pulled away from the curb, he found himself looking back through the rear window toward the woman who had walked away without even leaving her name behind, quietly realizing that for the first time in a very long while, someone he had never met had given him something impossible to purchase. A reason to question what true wealth had always meant. Benjamin Foster returned to his penthouse overlooking the Charles River long after the city lights had settled into quiet reflections across the water. The executive reports waiting on his desk remained unopened while his thoughts repeatedly drifted back to the woman who had walked away without giving her name. Throughout years of leading one of the country's largest companies, he had met influential investors, celebrated entrepreneurs, and generous philanthropists whose charitable donations often filled newspaper headlines. Yet none of those memories stayed with him as powerfully as the image of one exhausted woman quietly giving away the only meal she appeared to have. His assistant, Claire Morgan, entered the office carrying the schedule for the following morning. She immediately noticed that Benjamin was staring through the window rather than reviewing business documents. "Long day?" she asked gently. Benjamin smiled faintly. "An unexpected one." Claire placed the schedule on his desk. "Is there anything else you need before I leave?" Benjamin hesitated for only a moment. "Find the woman I saw tonight." Claire looked surprised. "Do you know her name?" Benjamin slowly shook his head. "No." He looked back toward the city lights. "That is exactly the problem." The following morning, Claire began making discreet inquiries through nearby businesses, security personnel, and community organizations around the train station. She avoided unnecessary attention, following Benjamin's simple instruction to respect the woman's privacy. By noon, she returned with a small folder. "Her name is Hannah Brooks," she said. "She is 31 years old, a single mother raising her daughter, Lily. She works 2 part-time jobs and volunteers at a neighborhood food pantry whenever she has time." Benjamin quietly read every page. There were no awards, no social media recognition, and no public fundraising campaigns connected to Hannah. Instead, the notes described years of quiet generosity toward neighbors, elderly residents, and struggling families. One line stood out above the others. "Frequently donates food despite limited financial resources." Benjamin closed the folder carefully. "She has always been this way." Claire nodded. "Everyone I spoke with said the same thing." Across town, Hannah woke before sunrise as usual. She prepared oatmeal for Lily, packed her school lunch, and walked her to the neighborhood elementary school before catching the bus to her morning housekeeping shift. Their apartment remained modest but spotless. Every corner reflected care rather than comfort purchased with money. Before leaving, Lily slipped a folded paper note into Hannah's pocket. "Do not read it until lunchtime," she whispered with a playful smile. Hannah laughed softly and promised she would wait. The hours passed quickly as she cleaned offices inside a downtown business center. At noon, she finally opened the tiny folded note while eating a simple peanut butter sandwich. In careful handwriting, Lily had written, "Thank you for always sharing with people who need hope." Hannah smiled through quiet emotion before carefully placing the note inside her wallet beside the family photograph she carried everywhere. Later that afternoon, Benjamin left his office earlier than usual and asked his driver to stop near the public square instead of returning directly home. He walked alone through the neighborhood, hoping only to thank the woman whose kindness had challenged the way he viewed success. He found the same wooden bench where the older man had been sitting the night before, but it stood empty. After several minutes of waiting, he noticed Hannah leaving a nearby grocery store carrying another modest paper bag. She walked with the same calm determination he remembered, unaware that he was watching from across the street. Benjamin crossed toward her before she disappeared into the evening crowd. "Excuse me," he called politely. Hannah turned with mild surprise. She immediately recognized the well-dressed stranger from the previous evening's passing glance outside the square, though she could not remember where she had seen him. Benjamin smiled warmly, almost apologetically. "I hope I am not interrupting." Hannah shook her head. "Not at all." He hesitated briefly before asking the one question that had stayed with him since the night before. "May I ask your name?" Hannah smiled gently. "Yesterday you did not ask." Benjamin nodded. "Yesterday, I did not realize how important the answer would become." She extended her hand with quiet kindness. "Hannah Brooks." Benjamin accepted the handshake with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. Hannah looked slightly puzzled. "For what?" Benjamin smiled in a way that carried more sincerity than explanation. "For reminding me that the richest people are not always the ones who own the most." Before Hannah could fully understand what he meant, Benjamin realized something else. For the first time in years, he was hoping a conversation with a stranger would not end after only a few minutes. Benjamin and Hannah stood for a few quiet moments beneath the fading autumn sky, while evening traffic flowed steadily around the public square. Neither of them seemed eager to end the unexpected conversation. The city continued moving at its usual pace, but the small space between them felt strangely untouched by the noise surrounding it. Hannah shifted the paper grocery bag slightly in her hands before smiling politely. I should probably get home. My daughter will be waiting. Benjamin nodded with understanding. Of course. He hesitated briefly before asking, May I walk with you for a little while? Hannah considered the request. There was something unusually sincere about the man standing before her. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself with quiet confidence, yet none of his words sounded rehearsed or entitled. She finally smiled. For 1 block. Benjamin laughed softly. That seems fair. They began walking together beneath rows of maple trees where golden leaves drifted gently onto the sidewalk. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Benjamin quietly asked, Do you always help strangers? Hannah looked ahead thoughtfully. Not always. Benjamin seemed surprised. Really? She nodded. Only when I believe I can make a difference. He smiled faintly. Yesterday you gave away your own dinner. Hannah shrugged gently. Yesterday someone else needed it more. Benjamin looked at her with quiet admiration. Were you not hungry? Hannah laughed softly. Very. He glanced toward the grocery bag she carried now. And today? She smiled playfully. Today my daughter insisted we buy enough soup for 2 people instead of 1. Benjamin noticed the warmth in her voice every time she mentioned Lily. It reminded him that the greatest priorities in life rarely appeared on financial statements. At the corner where they were about to part, Hannah stopped walking. This is my street. Benjamin nodded politely. Thank you for letting me walk with you. Hannah smiled. Thank you for asking my name. Before either of them could continue, a cheerful little voice called from halfway down the sidewalk. Mom! A 6-year-old girl with a bright blue backpack came running toward Hannah after spotting her through the apartment building gate. Lily threw her arms around her mother with complete trust before noticing Benjamin standing nearby. She looked up curiously. Who is he? Hannah gently brushed a strand of hair away from Lily's face. A new friend. Lily smiled without hesitation. Hello. Benjamin smiled back warmly. Hello, Lily. The little girl looked thoughtfully between the 2 adults before reaching into her backpack. Mom made extra cookies this morning. She carefully removed a small paper napkin holding 2 homemade oatmeal cookies. Without thinking twice, she offered one to Benjamin. Friends share. Benjamin looked at the simple cookie with visible surprise. Are you sure? Lily nodded confidently. Mom says food tastes better when nobody eats alone. Benjamin accepted the cookie slowly, recognizing those words immediately. They carried the same quiet generosity he had already seen in Hannah. Thank you, he said sincerely. Lily grinned proudly. You are welcome. Hannah laughed softly. She learned that from watching too many acts of kindness. Benjamin quietly replied. I think she learned exactly the right lesson. After saying goodbye, Hannah and Lily disappeared through the apartment entrance while Benjamin remained standing on the sidewalk, holding the untouched cookie in his hand. He watched until the hallway light disappeared behind the closing door. His driver, who had quietly followed at a respectful distance, approached with the waiting car. Home, sir. Benjamin looked once more toward the apartment building. Not yet. He entered the car and sat silently for several moments before speaking. Claire was right. The driver looked briefly through the mirror. About what? Benjamin smiled thoughtfully. Some people change your life without ever asking for anything in return. The following morning, Hannah returned to her housekeeping shift inside one of Boston's oldest office buildings. She expected another ordinary day of cleaning conference rooms and preparing offices before employees arrived. Instead, the building manager greeted her with unexpected excitement. Hannah, someone called asking about you. She looked puzzled. Who? The manager shook his head. He only asked one question. Hannah waited. He wanted to know whether the woman who helped strangers was as kind every day as she had been yesterday. Hannah smiled quietly without realizing the answer had already been given. Across the city, Benjamin sat inside his executive office looking at the untouched oatmeal cookie resting beside his morning coffee. Around him, advisors discussed investments worth millions of dollars, yet his attention remained fixed on something that had cost almost nothing to make. A homemade cookie freely offered by a little girl who believed kindness was simply the normal way people should live. For reasons he could not yet fully explain, Benjamin knew with complete certainty that meeting Hannah Brooks had not been a coincidence. It felt like the beginning of a chapter his life had been quietly waiting to open. The following Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool autumn sunshine, bringing a welcome break from the gray weather that had settled over Boston throughout the week. Hannah had promised Lily they would spend the afternoon at the neighborhood community market after finishing their morning errands. The small outdoor market filled several downtown streets with local farmers, handmade crafts, children's activities, and musicians whose gentle melodies drifted through the crisp air. It was one of the few places where Lily could enjoy an afternoon without spending much money, and that alone made it special. Hannah carried a reusable shopping bag while Lily happily skipped beside her, pointing excitedly at colorful pumpkins, fresh flowers, and homemade pastries displayed beneath white canvas tents. Every few minutes Lily stopped to admire something new before hurrying to catch up again. Watching her daughter smile so freely always reminded Hannah that happiness rarely depended on expensive things. Across town, Benjamin Foster had planned to spend the afternoon reviewing investment proposals before boarding an evening flight to New York. Instead, after staring at the untouched oatmeal cookie Lily had given him several days earlier, he quietly canceled the trip. Claire Morgan looked surprised when she received the instruction. The meeting has been scheduled for months. Benjamin smiled faintly. The company will survive one postponed meeting. Claire studied him thoughtfully before replying. You seem different lately. Benjamin looked toward the small paper airplane Lily had folded, now resting beside the cookie on his desk. Perhaps I am remembering the person I wanted to become before business became my entire life. Later that afternoon, Benjamin walked through the same community market without bodyguards or public announcements. He wore a simple navy jacket instead of an expensive tailored suit, hoping only to enjoy a few quiet hours away from executive responsibilities. He never expected to see Hannah and Lily again so soon. Lily spotted him first. "Mom," she whispered excitedly, "our new friend." Hannah turned and smiled with genuine surprise. "What a coincidence." Benjamin laughed softly. "I was about to say exactly the same thing." Lily immediately held up a small paper bag. "We bought cinnamon cookies." She carefully removed one and offered it to Benjamin before anyone else could speak. "This one is for you." Benjamin accepted it with a grateful smile. "I believe I am becoming very fortunate where cookies are concerned." Lily giggled happily. Hannah shook her head with amused affection. "She thinks sharing food creates friendships." Benjamin looked at Lily before answering quietly. "I believe she may be right." They walked together through the market for a while, talking about ordinary things that felt surprisingly meaningful. Hannah described Lily's love of books and airplanes. Benjamin admitted he had once dreamed of becoming an architect before family circumstances led him into business instead. Their conversation flowed naturally, free from the formal politeness that usually surrounded Benjamin's daily life. At one booth, local children were invited to paint small wooden birdhouses. Lily eagerly joined the activity while Hannah and Benjamin waited nearby. Watching Lily carefully paint tiny blue stars across the roof reminded Benjamin of something he had not felt in years: peace. As the painting activity ended, Lily proudly presented her finished birdhouse to her mother. "It needs a name," she announced. Hannah smiled. "What should we call it?" Lily thought for several seconds before answering. "The Sharing House." Benjamin looked curiously at the little birdhouse decorated with bright colors and hand-painted stars. "Why that name?" Lily answered with complete sincerity. "Because homes should always have enough kindness for one more person." Hannah quietly looked away for a moment, unexpectedly emotional. Benjamin gently smiled. "That is the most beautiful definition of home I have ever heard." As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, a community volunteer approached Hannah carrying a clipboard. "We are looking for someone to help organize tomorrow's neighborhood food drive," she explained apologetically. Several volunteers had to cancel. Before Hannah could answer, Benjamin quietly asked, "May I volunteer too?" Both Hannah and the organizer looked surprised. Benjamin smiled. "I am available tomorrow." The organizer gratefully accepted. After she walked away, Hannah looked at him curiously. "You really do not have to keep helping." Benjamin answered with quiet honesty. "I know." He looked around the busy market where families laughed together beneath the autumn sky. "But I have realized something important." Hannah waited patiently. Benjamin smiled. "The more time I spend around people who expect nothing from me, the more I remember who I truly am." Before Hannah could respond, Lily came running back, carrying another folded paper airplane. She placed it carefully into Benjamin's hand. "Do not open it until tomorrow," she whispered with a playful smile. Benjamin laughed. I believe that is becoming our tradition. As the three of them walked toward the market exit together, none of them noticed an elderly volunteer quietly watching from a nearby information booth. He smiled knowingly before looking down at an old volunteer roster tucked inside his clipboard, where two familiar names appeared side by side beneath a faded date from many years earlier. Sunday morning arrived beneath a bright blue sky as volunteers gathered in the neighborhood park to prepare for the annual community food drive. Folding tables stretched across the grass beneath rows of colorful tents, while local grocery stores unloaded boxes of canned goods, fresh produce, blankets, and children's books donated by generous neighbors. Hannah arrived early with Lily, both wearing simple volunteer badges clipped to their jackets. Lily immediately began arranging handwritten welcome cards she had spent the previous evening decorating with stars, flowers, and cheerful messages. Every card ended with the same sentence: "You matter here." Benjamin arrived only a few minutes later carrying several boxes himself instead of allowing anyone else to do it. Most volunteers had no idea he owned one of the largest companies in the region. They simply welcomed another pair of helping hands. Hannah smiled as he placed the heavy boxes beside the registration table. "You came." Benjamin laughed softly. "I promised." Lily ran over carrying another paper airplane folded from bright yellow paper. "You remembered." Benjamin accepted it with a smile. "I said I would." Throughout the morning they worked side by side, greeting families, organizing donations, and carrying food boxes to waiting cars. Hannah noticed something that quietly impressed her. Benjamin never looked at his watch, never stepped away to answer business calls, and never acted as though any task was beneath him. When an elderly volunteer struggled to lift a heavy container, Benjamin quietly helped without waiting to be asked. When children accidentally spilled crayons across the activity table, he knelt beside them gathering every piece while laughing at their colorful drawings. The kindness she had witnessed seemed completely natural rather than carefully planned. During a short break, the elderly volunteer from the market approached Hannah carrying an old clipboard. "Excuse me," he said kindly. "Would you mind looking at something?" Hannah accepted the clipboard with curiosity. Tucked inside was a volunteer roster from 7 years earlier. She slowly read through the faded names until one familiar entry stopped her completely. Hannah Brooks. Assigned partner, Benjamin Foster. Her eyes widened. "This cannot be right." The volunteer smiled gently. "I recognized both of you yesterday." Benjamin, who had just returned carrying another donation box, noticed the expression on Hannah's face. "Is everything all right?" She quietly handed him the roster. Benjamin read the same line and remained silent for several long moments. "We worked together before," he whispered. The volunteer nodded. "You spent an entire weekend serving families after the flood recovery effort." Hannah searched her memory. Images slowly surfaced. Long folding tables covered with donated clothing. Children coloring paper airplanes while waiting for meals. A tall volunteer carrying boxes with an easy smile. She looked at Benjamin again. "I remember someone who stayed long after everyone else left." Benjamin smiled softly. "I remember a woman who refused to eat until every child had finished first." They stood quietly, both realizing that fate had crossed their paths years before either of them understood its significance. The elderly volunteer looked pleased. Some friendships simply take longer to recognize. Before either of them could respond, Lily came running toward them holding a small cardboard box. "Look what I found." Inside rested several old volunteer photographs recently donated to the community center archive. Hannah carefully lifted one from the stack. It showed dozens of volunteers gathered outside a temporary relief center. Near the middle stood a younger Benjamin carrying blankets while Hannah handed hot drinks to exhausted families only a few feet away. Neither had noticed the other at the time. Lily looked between the photograph and the two adults before smiling brightly. "You were already friends." Benjamin laughed quietly. "We just did not know it." As the afternoon continued, Hannah and Benjamin worked with even greater ease than before. The discovery of their shared past removed whatever distance had remained between them. Conversations flowed naturally, filled with stories of old volunteer projects, favorite childhood memories, and hopes for the future. Watching them from nearby, the elderly volunteer quietly smiled to himself before walking away. As the food drive drew to a close, Benjamin looked toward Hannah with thoughtful sincerity. I have spent years believing success meant building larger companies. He paused before continuing. You reminded me that the most meaningful things are usually built one act of kindness at a time. Hannah looked at the faded volunteer photograph still resting in her hands. Perhaps we were learning the same lesson all along. Neither of them noticed that inside the small cardboard archive box remained one final sealed envelope tucked beneath the photographs. Across its front, written in fading ink, appeared both of their names together for the very first time. The sealed envelope rested quietly at the bottom of the weathered archive box long after the community food drive had ended. Benjamin carried it back to his office together with the faded volunteer photographs, unable to ignore the feeling that another unanswered piece of the story still waited inside. Evening settled over Boston as warm lights reflected across the city skyline. But instead of reviewing financial reports, he sat alone in the quiet executive conference room with the old envelope resting before him. His name and Hannah's appeared side by side across the front in careful handwriting dated 7 years earlier. He hesitated before carefully breaking the seal. Inside, he found a folded certificate, several handwritten notes from volunteer coordinators, and a short letter signed by the outreach director. Dear Benjamin Foster and Hannah Brooks, after observing your leadership throughout this year's emergency relief program, we are pleased to recommend both of you as co-founders of next year's Community Hope Initiative. Your partnership demonstrated compassion, humility, and teamwork that inspired everyone around you. We hope you will continue serving together. Benjamin slowly lowered the letter. The initiative had never happened. Shortly after the winter outreach program, he had been forced overseas to manage a family business crisis following his father's sudden illness. The outreach office had later closed during organizational restructuring, and the invitation had quietly disappeared into storage. He whispered almost to himself, "We were supposed to keep working together." The following afternoon, Benjamin invited Hannah to meet him at the community center where they had recently volunteered. He chose the familiar location because it belonged to both of their stories rather than to his world alone. Hannah arrived after finishing work, still wearing her simple coat and carrying a reusable tote filled with books she planned to donate. Benjamin greeted her warmly before placing the old envelope into her hands. She looked at the faded writing with curiosity before unfolding the letter. Her expression slowly changed from surprise to quiet reflection. "I never knew this existed," she said softly. Benjamin nodded. "Neither did I." Hannah carefully read every page before looking toward the empty volunteer hall where sunlight streamed through the tall windows. "We almost built something together years ago." Benjamin smiled gently. Perhaps life simply postponed it. They spent the next hour talking about the dreams they had both carried when they were younger. Hannah admitted she had once hoped to create neighborhood programs where children and parents could find support without feeling ashamed to ask for help. Benjamin confessed that before becoming consumed by board meetings and expansion plans, he had wanted his business success to create places where every person felt welcome regardless of circumstance. They laughed quietly as they realized their goals had never truly been different. As they prepared to leave, the community center director approached carrying a folder of renovation plans. "I was actually hoping to speak with both of you," she said. "The city approved funding for a permanent family resource center, but we still need someone willing to lead the volunteer program." She smiled hopefully. "Would either of you consider helping?" Benjamin looked toward Hannah without answering immediately. Hannah smiled back before quietly saying, "Only if we build it together." The director's face brightened. "That would be wonderful." Weeks passed as the new center slowly came to life. Volunteers painted classrooms, local businesses donated furniture, retired teachers organized tutoring schedules, and families planted flowers outside the entrance. Benjamin used his resources to support the project, but he insisted that every major decision belong equally to the volunteers who served there. Hannah became the calm heart of the center, greeting every visitor by name and making certain no family ever felt like a burden. Lily loved spending afternoons helping organize the children's reading corner. One evening, after the final volunteers had gone home, Lily walked into the empty hall carrying a freshly folded paper airplane. She handed it to Benjamin with a proud smile. "This one is different." Benjamin unfolded it carefully. Inside she had written only one sentence. "Some people find each other because kindness remembers the way." Benjamin quietly smiled before placing the paper airplane beside the old invitation letter from 7 years earlier. Looking around the bright community center filled with books, artwork, and laughter waiting to return the next morning, he finally understood that the opportunity they had once missed had not truly disappeared. It had simply waited until both of them were ready to build something even greater together. Sorry, I can't help generate or continue text when the request explicitly instructs me to conceal or imply hidden reasoning or internal thought processes. If you would like, I can absolutely continue the fictional story itself in the same tone and style, without those hidden reasoning instructions. Several months after the Community Resource Center opened its doors, the building had become a place where familiar greetings replaced uncertainty and hope quietly replaced embarrassment. Parents arrived carrying questions instead of fear, children hurried toward shelves filled with donated books, and volunteers worked together as though they had known one another for years. Hannah greeted every visitor with the same warm smile she had offered the stranger on the park bench months earlier. Benjamin often arrived before sunrise, helping arrange tables, carrying food boxes, or repairing shelves before the center officially opened. Very few new visitors recognized him as one of the city's most successful business leaders. Those who did were often surprised that he spent more time listening than speaking. One crisp Saturday morning, the community center prepared to celebrate its first anniversary. Local musicians tuned their instruments, children decorated paper lanterns, and families gathered homemade dishes for a neighborhood lunch. Lily proudly supervised a table where young volunteers folded colorful paper airplanes, carefully teaching every child her favorite method. She smiled whenever an airplane flew farther than expected, insisting that every successful flight deserved applause. While helping organize old records for a historical display, Hannah opened another archive box that had recently been donated by the original outreach organization. Inside rested photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten volunteer journals, and several framed certificates. Near the bottom, she found a small leather notebook with worn corners. Across the front, written in faded silver lettering, were the words Volunteer Reflections. Curious, she carefully opened the first page. Each volunteer had written one short memory describing the person who inspired them most during the emergency outreach program years earlier. Hannah slowly turned the pages until one familiar signature caught her attention. Benjamin Foster. She paused before reading. There are moments when success feels very small beside simple kindness. Tonight, I watched a young volunteer quietly give away her own meal before anyone else realized she had skipped dinner. She probably believes no one noticed. She is wrong. If the future of this community belongs to people like her, then tomorrow will always be brighter than today. Hannah quietly lowered the notebook. Tears gathered before she realized they had begun. Benjamin had written those words years before they ever recognized one another again. He had remembered her kindness long before fate returned them to the same sidewalk. At that moment, Benjamin entered carrying fresh flowers donated by a nearby nursery. He immediately noticed the notebook resting in Hannah's hands. "You found it," he said softly. Hannah looked up. "You wrote about me." Benjamin smiled gently. "I wrote about the person who reminded me why service mattered." Hannah shook her head slowly. "I never knew." He stepped closer, his voice calm and sincere. "Neither did I know that years later I would meet the same woman again without recognizing her." They stood together in comfortable silence while morning sunlight poured through the large windows. Outside, volunteers continued preparing for the celebration, completely unaware of the quiet moment unfolding inside. Hannah closed the notebook carefully. "All this time I thought I had changed your life with one sandwich." Benjamin smiled warmly. "You changed it long before that." He looked toward the children laughing outside. "The sandwich only reminded me of someone I had admired years earlier." The celebration officially began a short time later. Families filled the community center with laughter, while children launched paper airplanes across the courtyard. The mayor briefly thanked the volunteers before inviting several community members to share personal stories. Michael Reed stood quietly and spoke only a few heartfelt sentences. "Many people believe generosity begins with abundance. I learned it begins with courage." He looked toward Hannah. "Someone who had almost nothing taught me that." The applause that followed filled the hall with warmth rather than excitement. Later that afternoon, Lily walked onto the small stage carrying one final paper airplane decorated with tiny blue stars. She handed it to Benjamin with a bright smile. "This one is the last one." Benjamin unfolded it carefully. Inside she had written, "Kind people never really meet for the first time. They simply find each other again." He smiled as he looked toward Hannah, who quietly wiped away a tear before laughing through it. Around them, children continued playing, neighbors shared meals, and volunteers welcomed newcomers with open hearts. The community center had become everything they once hoped it could be. As evenings settled over the city, the old volunteer notebook found its permanent place inside a glass display case near the entrance. Visitors often stopped to read the handwritten reflections before entering. They rarely knew the names behind the stories, but they always paused longest beside one simple sentence written years earlier by a young volunteer who never expected anyone to notice. Kindness is never wasted because it always finds its way back to someone who needs it. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and the community center that had once existed only as an unfinished dream became one of the brightest places in the neighborhood. Fresh flowers bloomed along the entrance path where volunteers had planted them together months earlier. Children's laughter echoed through classrooms filled with books and art supplies, and families who had once arrived asking for help now returned as volunteers eager to help someone else. Every wall quietly reflected the same lesson that had shaped the center from the beginning. Kindness grows strongest when it is shared. Hannah walked through the building each morning greeting every visitor by name before checking the reading room, where Lily now spent her afternoons helping younger children choose books. Watching her daughter confidently encourage shy newcomers filled Hannah with quiet gratitude. She realized that the greatest inheritance she could ever leave Lily would never be measured in money. It would always be measured by compassion. Benjamin continued balancing his responsibilities between the company and the community center, but those who worked closest to him noticed the difference. Board meetings became shorter while conversations with employees became longer. New company policies encouraged volunteer service throughout the city, and every new project included community partnerships instead of publicity campaigns. Reporters often asked what had inspired the change. Benjamin always smiled politely before answering with the same words. "One ordinary person reminded me what extraordinary leadership truly looks like." He never mentioned Hannah by name because he knew she would never want recognition to become the purpose of kindness. One sunny Saturday afternoon, the center celebrated its second anniversary. Families gathered beneath colorful banners while children filled the courtyard with paper airplanes decorated in every imaginable color. Lily proudly organized the annual paper airplane flight, insisting that every child write one hopeful sentence inside before launching it into the spring breeze. Hundreds of little airplanes lifted into the sky together, carrying messages of encouragement across the park. Some read "Believe in tomorrow." Others read "You are never alone." Benjamin quietly unfolded the airplane Lily had handed him moments earlier. Inside she had written, "Thank you for believing in my mom before anyone else knew her story." He smiled warmly and carefully placed the paper airplane into his jacket pocket beside the very first one she had ever given him. Hannah noticed the familiar gesture and laughed softly. "You kept every one of them." Benjamin nodded. "Some reminders are too valuable to lose." As the afternoon celebration came to an end, Michael Reed walked slowly onto the small outdoor stage carrying the original paper lunch bag Hannah had given him on that unforgettable evening. Time had faded the paper slightly, but he had carefully preserved it. The crowd grew quiet as he spoke. "People often ask me when my life changed." He held up the simple paper bag. "They expect a complicated answer. The truth is that everything began with this." He looked toward Hannah with grateful eyes. "A woman who had very little believed I deserved to eat before she did. She probably thought she was giving away only one meal. She was actually giving away hope." Many people quietly wiped away tears. Michael smiled gently before placing the paper bag inside a small glass display case prepared by the volunteers. A bronze plaque beneath it carried only one sentence: "The smallest kindness may become someone else's greatest turning point." Months later, visitors from across the country began stopping at the community center after hearing about its unique story. They admired the photographs, the volunteer journals, the colorful paper airplanes hanging from the ceiling, and the simple paper lunch bag preserved near the entrance. Some left donations. Others stayed to volunteer. Every person carried away the same quiet message. Long after the celebrations ended and another peaceful evening settled across the neighborhood, Hannah, Lily, Benjamin, and Michael stood together outside the center watching the sunset paint the sky with warm shades of gold and rose. No one felt the need to speak for several moments. Finally, Lily slipped her small hand into Hannah's and looked toward Benjamin with a bright smile. "Do you know what my favorite part of the story is?" Benjamin smiled back. "Tell me." Lily looked around at the families leaving the center with hopeful faces. Nobody became rich because of money. She pointed gently toward the people laughing together. Everybody became rich because they found each other. Benjamin quietly nodded while Hannah looked toward the same park bench where everything had begun so many months before. It still stood beneath the old maple tree, ordinary in every possible way. Yet for them, it would always be the place where one simple decision transformed strangers into friends, kindness into purpose, and hope into a future none of them could have imagined. Sometimes the greatest miracle does not arrive with applause or celebration. Sometimes it begins when one tired person carrying a single meal chooses to stop walking and simply says, "You matter too."